good morning to one and all. Greetings on World Food Day from A.D. Patel Institute of Technology, CVM University. At ADIT, we are fortunate to have one of the emerging branches of engineering, food processing technology, which was started in early 2000 in order to cater to food processing industry and train the required manpower. Over these years, we have trained many food technologists who are doing very well in different industries. This year, the department has also started a MTech program in food technology. So we have been going from strength to strength as far as the food processing department is concerned. We all know processing of food helps us to increase the outreach of the food and make it available to the masses all around the year at good value proposition. On this World Food Day, we have got eminent speakers, Ms. Trusha Mehta and Mr. Suyal Abdi. I hope all the participants will enjoy these lectures and commit to the cause of World Food Day through endeavor of food processing industry. So thank you all, and once again, greetings on World Food Day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for kind words of inspiration and motivation. Before we proceed, I would like to inform all the participants to kindly keep their audio mute and video off if possible, so that they can hear better. We will start with the introduction of our first speaker today, Ms. Trusha Mehta. She is currently manager, quality, regulatory and technology at Bell Formageries, Mumbai, which is an Indian subsidiary of Bell Group based out of France. She is having about 10 years of professional experience in product development and quality control. Previously, she has worked for organizations General Mills, AAK Kamani Industries, and most importantly, I would like to mention here with a pride that she is an alumnus of ADI and completed her graduation in year 2010. Today she will be talking about the role of food safety and quality across supply chain. Now I invite Ms. Trusha to deliver a talk on this topic. Yes, Trusha, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Principal Sir, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to present to the students of ADIT on the World Food Day about the role of food safety and quality control across supply chain. Is my screen visible?
Yes, Trusha, it is visible.
Okay. So today when we talk about this topic on the role of food safety, quality control across supply chain, we inherently together talk about three individual topics: food safety, quality control, and supply chain. So before we start, let us just have a brief understanding of what three different topics have an individual role, and when we talk about its combination, what can we achieve and how. So let's talk about what is food safety. Food safety, as the name indicates, highlights the consumption of food which is safe. So it is basically the practice and the condition that preserves the food, which will help prevent the contamination and illnesses. Illnesses are basically the foodborne illnesses that we commonly hear about. While food quality is the degree of excellence of the food characteristic, which is acceptable to consumers. So when we talk about the degree of excellence, it basically defines the appearance, the textures, the specification a food needs to have for its consumers to be acceptable. When put together, both food safety and quality will ensure all the safety measures from the farmers or the suppliers to the consumers. It ensures the safety, all the nutritional quality, and the total food acceptability of the product which is designed for consumers. Let's talk about what the food supply chain means. A supply chain itself is a word which indicates the word supply of food, which is through a chain of all the different processes. It is basically from a farm to a factory or a processing unit to the fork. It talks about 3 F's, from farm to factory to fork. Fork is to the end consumers onto the table. All the processes starting from production of the raw material to its processing, packaging, distribution, consumption, and at the end, it also includes the disposal of all the food that is being produced. Now, when we talk about what is food safety and quality control, let us also talk about why it is so important in the supply chain management. There can be n number of reasons of its importance, but what I try to do is, let's talk about the 4 basic understanding on why quality control can be so critical when we talk about the supply chain management. It is one to do with the defects and the scraps. Defect and scrap related to the raw material. If we have a non-standard raw material, which we procure in our factory, it will increase our defect rates. Example, if we have got a flour, say in a cake processing unit, when we have this raw material, which is actually as per the standards of the specification, but while the lot has been in the plant, it has some infestation, which is non-identified while it's received. But if it is within the facility, the infestation will lead the product to be a non-standard product, which cannot be used. Imagine a situation wherein we use this raw material to produce the final good, example cake mixes, and after the entire production and the finished good is ready to be packed, you identify that there has been some infestation issue. This will lead to complete disposal of the finished good that you have made. So the defect and scrap will be very, very high. It can also lead to some external limitation. Example, a poor supply chain management will not have a proper control of the finished good which will reach to the consumers. It can lead to a lot of product failures which will indirectly have higher returns. So there can be a lot of limiting factors wherein the product can wear out. The product, we have a great case of Dairy Milk chocolate wherein we had found this infestation. Was that infestation during when the product was in the facility? Probably no. It might have happened due to a poor supply chain management, where the conditions of the storage might have been improper, or maybe there were external limitations which lead to this contamination. The third topic can be the inspection and audit, which is most commonly known word when we talk about quality control. The inspection and audit, in case are failed, or if there are a lot of non-compliances which we observe during these audits and are not taken care of or are not addressed immediately, can lead to a lot of quality related problems. Lack of visibility. Supply chain visibility is a very, very key factor to be known. Without a proper supply chain transparency, the area of quality or wherever the business can have a lot of factors of failures. If there is no transparency, it can have a devastation effect for your company. Visibility is a prerequisite. It means you need to understand every step where you have your inventory at any time, from passing out of the factory till it reaches the retailer, or also the traceability. As we talk about this, we know that an issue can raise at any point in supply chain. We spoke about that. Supply chain is basically from farm to factory to fork. It can be due to a raw material mishandling or maybe a final good or a final finished good which is not maintained properly. This can be either due to a poor management, which can have an error across, maybe either due to some equipment defect or maybe due to the transportation, or also can be a reason of a non-trained staff. When we talk about the quality control importance and lack of visibility being one of the critical aspects, let's talk about the benefit that a supply chain transparency can help us. Have a great speed to market. It will reduce the vendor risk. Example, on the raw materials. It will have a lot of reduced risk when we know the quality inspection of the vendors which we procure our raw materials from. It can help us identify our quality control problems at a very, very early stage. Also, we can have a real-time analytics. For example, if we understand that there is some quality control issue happening in transit, and we have this visibility available, we can immediately try to have identify this process and start getting the risk mitigation for this. And also it will help us improve our vendor relationship, which is very, very critical. When we talk about quality control, it's just not about giving those suppliers the specifications or the ingredient hazard list. It is about the relationship with the vendor, which will ensure the trust that the raw material that you procure from there will have some quality norms to be followed. When we talk about all of this, we should not miss about the risk that we associate with all this. What is risk? Risk can be defined as either a likelihood of a negative event, which can be coincided with a consequence of its severity. A hazard plus an outrage is basically a risk. Hazard is something which is a technical issue or an error in a food product, while outrage is basically the emotional connect which we have related with the hazard. Outrage is the only driving factor which actually creates the force of risk perception, which we will talk about. Risk can be a real risk or a perceived risk. Let's talk about what a real risk can be. A real risk is something which you know is going to happen. Example, salmonella in eggs. It's a very, very known real risk which actually happens. Real risk is basically the risk which we know that is likely to happen. Example, the salmonella in eggs. But a perceived risk is something which is due to the anxiety of an outrage. What if? What if the consumers does not like it? What if my consumer falls sick? But a perceived risk can also be turned into a real risk. We all have a very, very recent example of corona pandemic, wherein it was a perceived risk from a certain country, and now it is turned out to be a real risk across the world. There can also be a risk which we can differentiate between a food safety risk, a regulatory risk, or an economic risk. It is very important for us to understand the difference between these risks for us to have the risk assessment or the risk management based on this. When we talk about a regulatory risk, it is basically involved with the regulatory actions. So we have a lot of regulatory norms given by our authorities, example FSSAI. We have an example on the regulatory risk which was due to the lead in Maggie. It was a big chaos. So it was a hazard, yes, but the outrage, the emotional connect with the brand Maggie had a massive impact on this risk. A food safety risk can be due to a presence of any of the physical or maybe a poor handling of food. Maybe a machinery part gets packed into the finished good. That can be a food safety risk as well. Due to a physical hazard, can be due to microbial or can be due to chemical. An economic risk is also very important because it relates to the financial risk. It impacts the financials of the company. It can be a food safety risk or it cannot be a food safety risk. But if it is leading to any financial impact, it is considered as an economic risk. Example, a spoilage of a product leading to its disposal. A spoilage of the product which is not probably a food safety risk, but if you identify this happening across any time at the supply chain, we will ensure that this product does not reach the consumers and it needs to be disposed, recalled, discarded before that. And that has a critical financial impact. Risk assessment also involves probability, a potential impact, and an exposure. When you have this done together as a risk analysis, it can be identified as a risk assessment, probably a very, very known word. Have we done a risk assessment of this project? Probably that's not all. A risk assessment is only scientifically based. You will identify probably a hazard, the characteristic of the hazard, and you might assess it with the risk characterization. But it is always important to complete a risk analysis with two other steps about managing the risk and also about communication. While we speak about the managing risk, it's basically about its evaluation. What assessment you have done and how can you manage the assessment? It can be done based on some of the monitoring methods, maybe some tools that you do it together with your management. So when you have a risk assessment, it's basically done by a smaller group of quality control or the risk assessors. But when we talk about the management, it goes to a one step ahead with the senior management when you have this discussions of how do you assess or manage the assessed risk. This communication is a new terminology which is rising now. Identifying or assessing the risk and understanding the ways to manage it, it's very, very important that we also have the risk communication done in a right way. If the risk communication is not taken in a very, very positive way, it can lead to a lot of consequences. It is basically not an exchange only within the organization with the higher stakeholders, but it is also about communication of the risk to your customers. And how do you manage it? Sometimes media plays an important role here. Sometimes your public needs to know what do you do to assess the risk. Maggie is an exceptional case. With the lead content in it, there was a lot of chaos about Maggie being, having a lead which is getting into some toxic effect to the human body. So how do you communicate it? The risks that kills you are not necessarily the risk that angers or frightens you. So hazard can not always be like an outrage to your anxiety or an anger. To bridge the gap between these two, a risk manager, the government, the food laws, and the industry should have this risk communication taken to another level. When we know what are the risks, it is very important for us to also identify where are the risks. And now when we associate it to supply chain, the risk starts from the step one of raw material till the consumer uses or consumer misuses the product. There are n number of steps where we can identify the risk depending on the severity, but yes, the risk does exist. Does it be in a raw material? Yes, it can be because of your microbial, chemical, or the physical hazards. Can be because your ingredient lot separation has some concerns. Maybe a contamination through packaging. Raw material does not only talk about the food ingredients, it is also about the packaging as a raw material before it gets into the finished good. Can the risk be in the product formulation? Probably yes. If you design a product formulation which has a very high microbial growth, but if you do not have a lethality step to address that, it can be a concern. Formula also can use a high-risk ingredient. Example, moisture. If you are planning to have a shelf-stable product developed, but the moisture content is not addressed in the right limits, where the water activity can be impacted, yes, it can be a risk. A total product offering. A TPO is defined as a total product offering. It includes your product, your packaging. Everything together can also lead to a risk. Maybe there can be some examples wherein your formulation is stable, your packaging in isolation is stable. But when you put your product and packaging together, there may be a chance that any chemical component can transfer to your product. Maybe there is some chemical note in that, some packaging chemical that can migrate to your product. That can be a risk too. There can be a regulatory risk. When we talk about a lot of our standards, do you have documentation available all the time? Do you adhere to the claims that the government asks you to do it? Your internal company claims, do you stick to your standards? Or some unintended use that you do away from regulation? As I said, packaging is also something very, very critical. There can be a lot of cases wherein a non-food grade material is a hazard. We might say that once the food gets packed, you can have an inkjet printing on that. There can be a coating layer, but is the ink that is used for this printing safe? Is it a food grade? That can be a risk too going further. Or can be a stacking. If you mix your allergen, if you incorrectly label your packaging material, can have a risk associated to that. It can also happen during transport, distribution, and storage. This term, logistic, is a very, very severe risk associated term. It can have a lack of security, probably a mishandling of food while loading, unloading, damages on the packaging. The temperature controls are incorrect, and a lot of chances of cross-contamination can also lead to this risk. When we talk about consumer uses and misuses, it is a risk indirectly to the company where a consumer might not follow the cooking directions written on the pack. And you cannot go to the consumer and ensure that this is getting followed. Example, if I correlate anything to a premix or a cake mix, the consumer buys the product. It is a raw cake mix. Although all these parameters, specifications are taken into consideration, there can be a risk associated to having a raw dough. It has flour inside, it has cocoa powder inside. There can be a lot of risk associated with it, which a company might have considered that because this product needs to be cooked, it is supposed to be baked probably at 180, 200 degrees Celsius for a certain time frame, the risk associated post-cooking will be negligible. Are you sure? Are you sure your consumers might just not lick the dough and taste how it is? You have no control. So a risk can be associated at any point of time, at any level. Let's get a little detail on what are the risks when we talk about individuals. So maybe with raw material, we spoke about ingredient and packaging. It can be from the source of raw material and also where it is used. Why I highlight the source is basically an ingredient source can vary. You might have two different suppliers who might source the same ingredient from two different states, two different countries. Example, we have cocoa powders. Cocoa powders are available from a lot of other sources, maybe Ivory, Ghana. There are different sources. There can be a little different hazards associated to that. identifying allergens on the raw material is a very, very critical risk. For India, probably allergens are not that severe, that critical. But if you see across the food industry, allergen declaration or identifying the allergens in raw material or the cross-contamination risk is very, very significant and can lead to a very, very big impact. For India, probably the celiac disease is not very critical. We are a country who have been eating cereals, wheat-based products since our childhood, since our birth. But some people abroad do have the celiac disease, lactose intolerance, lot of concerns like this. The raw material hazards are divided into chemical, physical, and microbiological. We might not touch base into all of these in detail, considering these are the basic hazards understood by the food faculties, but just to ensure that when you know that these hazards are there, they originate from maybe supplier due to ingredients, due to incorrect processing technologies. It is important that we have this appropriate controls done. Let's start with the first step of ensuring that the suppliers we have, the suppliers we choose, are basically all at an approved level. This is where we talk about managing the risk. Risk is there. We know there are risks at every stage. Do we just leave the risk? No. Let's manage it. Is it easy to manage? Yes, it is, when you have the right steps to follow. Managing the risk starts with the supplier control. As we know that everything comes or starts with the procurement, ensure that the supplier that we choose have all the conditions to ensure the food safety, food quality. How do we do it? There are a lot of prerequisite programs which we can do, HACCP being one of that. We know HACCP has some critical control points. It starts from not only managing it at the supplier level, but also at the facility where we have this production level, where we design a food to be safe. It is basically an environmental and operating condition that are necessary to have this safe food that we produce. There can also be a new terminology that have come up along with HACCP. It talks about TACCP and it also talks about VACCP. It's very new. When HACCP talks about hazards, TACCP and VACCP talks about the threats, the tempering, the unintentional adulteration that we have, while VACCP talks about the vulnerabilities, the food frauds, maybe due to the economically motivated adulterations, or maybe it is basically like a unapproved production when you know something is wrong but still you do it. This can also be managed very, very intentionally through receiving, storage, and the shipping activities. All the raw materials that comes to your plant or the product that you store under needs to be in a sanitary condition, an environmental controlled condition. It is very, very important. When you procure this material, when you receive this material, it has all the certificate quality check passes. What if it is stored in a place where there is already an infestation available, where the environment control is not right? Example, storage of flour. We all know that flours are prone to infestation. We would have seen it probably in our day-to-day activity, probably in our own kitchens. What if it is stored in a very damp place, very humid place? It will give an environment for those larvae or the eggs to have this insect creator in the flour. A proper storage to assure allergens that they do not mix. Allergen identification is very, very critical. Example, you might not only produce one product in your facility, but you might have many products with different ingredients. Example, one product does not have milk solids in it, or milk powder, or skim milk powder. But the second SKU that you make in your plant has skim milk powder. This has an allergen concern. What if your screening is not proper? What if the storages are not right? What if you store it in a place where there is already some milk powder fallen? It's not clean. There can be a chance of cross-contamination. Proper labeling. What if you reject a lot due to quality inspection, but there is no identification, there is no labeling, and that lot gets into your processing unit? What happens then? It leads to a food quality hazard. Your food safety is on risk. Shipping of ingredients, the final packaging is all very, very critical. While we talk about shipping, it basically talks about the transportation or the truck, which we will take care in the next slides too. Disposition of ingredients in a timely manner is a very, very important process to be taken care of. What if you identify that your flour is infested? It is still in the same storage area. You highlighted that this needs to be discarded, disposed of. It still stays for probably 1 week more. Do you understand the criticality of this? Will it not impact the food safety, food quality of the product or the raw material in and around that area? The risk multiplies. And hence, it is very, very important to address the disposition of ingredient at the right time. Choosing the facilities and utilities. This is probably very, very critical and important when we talk about identifying a facility to have this production plan. We always say that, we might have identified any place wherein we can start. Really? Do you think your food safety and food quality will be addressed in a right way? It is important that your facility should be away from a residential area. We have had a lot of issues read in media, not of course many times from food industry, but leakage of gas, leakage of chemicals. There can be a lot of risk to the people around the areas where the facility is located. It is also about the land that you have to choose where does not have a lot of natural calamities occurrence. What if your area is prone to earthquakes? What if your area is prone to a natural calamity like floods? How are you going to address this issue? What if there is a tsunami? There is a flood? What if all of these impact your storage, your handling, your finished good areas? How do you address this? Proper measures needs to also be taken when we consider the separation of waste. We all have heard about the effluent treatment and its importance in the facility. How about giving what you have accepted in the facility? How about giving a better water outside, gardening? A lot of people use it. Is it compliance with the laws, the regulation that asks the food manufacturer or the food processing unit to be stable, to be created? This might be a very, very critical point, and where the food safety or the food quality role plays in. It is also about understanding the incoming, outcoming, designing structure, wherein a quality control parameters is important. What about if the drainages are not right? What impact will it have? Think about the pests coming out of those drains if it is not in a right way. What you have a drainage, but then the water keeps accumulating. Think about that. Packaging and storage of the final goods. We have been talking about a raw material, its packaging. What about the storage? It needs to have a food grade material. Yes, we know that. But do you have the surety of the COA on receipt? What critical checks have you run? Is your storage area in a very hygienic condition? Are you following all the labeling acts in a right way so that your finished good has all the right packaging information? Is the temperatures controlled? Is humidity controlled? It's not about only just keeping it at the right temperature. Humidity plays a very, very important factor. Do you follow FIFO? We all speak about FIFO. First in, first out. First, whatever is the older lot needs to go out first. Consumer needs to utilize this. But do you really think it is getting followed? What if there is something that's already close to expiry, but it's kept too behind the product which is manufactured currently? If the dispatches are all at the right way, the exit temperature, what if it is not done at the right temperature? Example, if you are making some cakes and the temperature needs to be 85 degrees after cooking, and then it needs to be cooled to minimum of 20 degrees. What if it is not 20 but 25 at an exit? Do you think the criticality when the hot product is getting packed, it does not have any way to cool it down or the condensation to escape? What will happen to your product? Of course, it depends to the category. A cake might not have a similar temperature condition as that of cheese. The storage of finished good product. You have to ensure that you have all these finished goods to be separated and stored about raw material if you have a same storage facility. Maybe the warehouses are not different for raw materials and finished goods, but a segregation to identify the raw materials and the finished goods is very, very important. We have the storage, and as I said that the conditions to control the temperature and the humidity is very, very critical. You need to have a desired specification to describe this condition. You need to have the monitoring done at a certain interval, depending on the kind of storage you have. The storages are generally identified based on 3 differentiations: an ambient storage, which is basically the normal room temperature conditions, wherein we do not have the right humidity or a control over temperatures. Example, in Mumbai, the temperature or the humidity will be very different. Mumbai might be very humid compared to that of Delhi, which is dry. The temperatures might be same, but the humidity will be different. What about dry storage? If your product is susceptible to absorb moisture or humidity from the air, you cannot have that product stored in a place where the humidity is higher. You need to have a dry storage, which is very, very critical, very, very important. What is conditioned storage? It talks about the cold storage or the chiller conditions where the products are to be kept. Example, a cheese, or maybe a fruit juice, which is not Tetra packed.